Kerala Museum is a vibrant beacon of the arts in Kochi. Founded in 1987 by R. Madhavan Nair, he had a vision of the need for Kochi to have institutions and spaces for culture, offering experiential learning in history, fine arts, and performing arts. Celebrating its 35th anniversary in 2022, the Kerala Museum launched its flagship initiative, General Archives, that excavates the micro-histories of Kerala, bringing storytelling to you through captivating digital exhibitions. The program is made possible through the support of the Geojit Foundation and honors the cherished dream of the museum's founder, Madhavan Nair, to make history accessible to all. The recently commenced Genel lecture series is part of the programming around Genel Digital Archives. And today, in the third lecture, we present Dr.J Devika. Dr. Devika is a faculty member at the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. Her expertise lies in history and its skillful application in the comprehending of modern-day matters, including politics, gender, development, and culture in the region of Kerala. She possesses fluency in both Malayalam and English, enabling her to produce scholarly works in both languages. She has published in historical, social scientific, gender studies, and cultural studies journals, and has 4 academic works in English. We take pleasure in inviting you, Dr. J Devika, to Kerala Museum and to the podium. Thank you all and enjoy the session.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Raji. Thanks all of you at the Kerala Museum for inviting me to give this talk. I am truly impressed by this series of conversations that you're trying to initiate, and I think these conversations are going to be very vital to the way we understand the region that we live in, which we call Kerala. I think we are at a crossroads in our history. The new millennium is bringing new challenges, both cultural and other challenges, which I don't think we can afford to ignore anymore. So I hope that this series gives us the resources to think through these challenges with greater depth. So I am trying to present today a series of thoughts on migration, which is a part and parcel of Kerala as we imagine it now. Kerala is a highly migration-dependent economy, as we all know, and migration is also very much part of our cultural heritage. In fact, as I will argue later, it's been part of our culture since quite a long time. And it's only that it is kind of difficult for us to acknowledge this as part of what has constituted us as a culture in a region like ours, which is actually more open to the sea. In fact, completely open to the sea. I mean, we have a coastline that runs along the length and breadth of our state. And it has been the case for many centuries. The fact that we have been seafarers for very long. So let me just start by introducing the term cosmopolitanism. It is very much in currency now. There is, in fact, there are very important first world metropolitan university center debates around cosmopolitanism. I will not enter in depth into those debates. Those are academic debates, but I definitely want to clarify the idea of cosmopolitanism before we start this discussion, because in this lecture I'm trying to think through these 3 concepts: cosmopolitanism, migration, and modernity, through and in the background of the history of Kerala in the 20th century. So we start with cosmopolitanism. The word cosmopolitanism comes from the Greek word cosmopolitis, and which which translates as world citizens, citizens of the world. In fact, this was in opposition to the rule in Greek city-states. I mean, the Greeks were divided into city-states, and citizenship was essentially associated with particular city-states. But there were some people who refused to accept that kind of a narrow definition, and who declared themselves to be the citizens of the cosmos, not of some narrow city-state. So the word cosmopolitanism comes from that kind of defiant posturing, and the core of it, of course, later develops. It's not in the Greek stage, but as the idea develops in history, the core becomes one of an ideal of a universal community. So the idea that it's possible to imagine a community of human beings who are not affiliated to any particular culture or state becomes the core of this concept. And of course, in time, it develops into an ideal, not just a defiant claim posed against an entity, be it a city-state or a country or a kingdom or whatever. It becomes an ideal to be achieved in the future, and the idea that all kinds of particularities can be shed in order to assume a particular core of humanity. So that becomes an ideal in history that everyone ought to aspire to, and that is actually a part of Enlightenment modernity, where philosophers like Immanuel Kant, for example, tell us that we should actually aspire to become world citizens by shedding our particularities. We should join in a moral community which is universal and beyond particular kinds of cultural or political affiliations. So, yes. So, as I said, it can be negative, like the Greek philosopher Diogenes, who refused to identify with his city-state. And he says, I'm a citizen of the cosmos. I am not bound by my city-state. Then, and as I said, the ideal kind of develops later, and there are very different versions of it. There is the Christian ideal, for example. Christianity proposed a certain kind of cosmopolitanism, in which it was understood that anybody who joined Christianity redeemed their humanity, their essential humanity, and therefore they were actually not bound by the affiliations of the states they belong to or the cultures they were born into. So, but Christ was very particular that Christians should acknowledge whichever state that they lived under. So he talked about how important it was to render to Caesar the things which are Caesar's, but he also encouraged Christians to shed their particularities, to treat all Christians as equal and the members of a world community. Then in the Enlightenment Europe, that is in the 18th century, the famous Encyclopedia Diderot and others, they defined the cosmopolitan as a man of no fixed abode or a man who is nowhere a stranger. So someone who does not put in roots anywhere but is not also a stranger anywhere. So the possessors, open to the world, speaks many languages, is able to travel, has the capacity to mingle in different cultures, does not perceive cultures as antagonistic to each other. That kind of a person is deemed to be a cosmopolitan. And of course, the pinnacle of these debates comes from, is reached in Immanuel Kant, who says that all rational beings are bound to be in a single moral community which is beyond the narrow particularities of nation states and cultures and so on. Yes, but this ideal also runs into trouble in the 20th century. Now, the 20th century brought a very, very powerful critique of colonialism. And it was pointed out that the Kantian moral cosmopolitanism was not free of the racism, the sexism, and colonial hubris. In fact, Kant, in some of his early works, was an apologist of colonialism. So the idea of the moral cosmopolis was not exactly in opposition to the colonial ambition and the white man's burden. And however, a version of cosmopolitanism is very, very convenient to the expanding capitalism of the time, colonial capitalism of the time, because the colonial rulers badly wanted to open up the local markets for their goods and also to buy goods, raw materials cheap. So for them, this was a very useful ideal. They could accuse anyone who was suspicious of colonial capitalism by just saying that you are narrow-minded, you are narrow, you just fear the foreigner, you're xenophobic, you don't want new people to come into your markets, and so you're not cosmopolitan enough. That kind of accusation was useful for capitalism to create a certain kind of psychological domination over people who were suspicious of capitalist exploitation and its effects. So the Marxism, of course, had its own version of cosmopolitanism. So Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto famously call upon all the proletarians of the world to unite. So the essential core of common humanity is now transferred on to the proletarian masses of the world. So Marxism has its own version of cosmopolitanism. Nevertheless, they believe that the evocation of this kind of cultural, the ease with which the cosmopolitans glide from culture to culture in Marxist critique is often associated with the ease of capital, moving from country to country and gaining control over markets. Now, this critique was considerably refined in the course of the 20th century, and you have several theorists looking at cosmopolitanism as essentially an apology for colonial exploitation. And in fact, Donna Haraway, the well-known feminist theorist and science studies scholar, calling it a conquering gaze from nowhere. That is, cosmopolitanism claims to be not affiliated to any particular culture or state, but the fact is that it is most often evoked by the privileged peoples of the world who are usually European or Anglo-American. So cosmopolitanism hides that fact, the fact that it is evoked mostly by the privileged peoples of the world. And it looks like it's coming from nowhere. And it induces people who are more locally, who are located in the peripheries of the world, in the southern parts of the world, to feel a certain kind of guilt, that they are not open enough to the world in some way, or they are not, expansive in the manner in which privileged peoples are. So this is a very brief history of the debates around cosmopolitanism. Now, so then you might think, why do we want to reflect on it now? If there is so much critique about it, so why should we even think about it? Now, I think there are two reasons. One, of course, is the fact that cosmopolitanism, even if it is a first world, as Haraway and others point out, is a first world ideal, I think there is something interesting to it, because we are all living, the times that we are living in now, I mean, after the 1990s, with the whatever is called the third wave democracy of the 1990s, has rapidly given way to very narrow jingoistic evocations of nationalism around the world. Now, this is happening not just in India, but also in other parts of the world, as we know so well, in Turkey, in Poland, in Europe. You have, in the US included, you have really very, very violently jingoistic, xenophobic groups that have taken over power, and now they control the discourse of nationalism. Now, this is a context in which we need to think of belonging, other ways of belonging to the world as human beings. So there are people who are thinking about planetary belonging in the sense of being ecological beings. So, Bruno Latour and others, for example, propose that we should stop calling ourselves human beings. We should call ourselves terrestrials rather than human beings, because the moment we call ourselves terrestrials, then we bring ourselves down to a level of equality with all other life on the earth. So there are such proposals happening, but I think it's also important for us to think about culture in beyond these narrow claims of belonging. In a very specific context of Kerala, now we know that Kerala as a state, as a linguistic entity, common entity, came into being in the middle of the 20th century with the formation of the state of Kerala, bringing together Malabar, which was a part of the Madras presidency, and Travancore and Kochi, which were both native states under the British. So we are fairly young cultural entity, and Kerala was understood as a common cultural entity, was understood in the 1940s and 50s and 60s under the hegemony of the left. And the three pillars, I'm drawing on my earlier work here. So this hegemony, which produced the national popular of Kerala in the 1940s, had three main pillars. One of it was development, the idea of welfareist development. The second was of the Malayalam language, and the third was of a shared culture in which the different people groups of people who form the Malayali shared. So there was a very, very strong attempt in the middle decades of the 20th century, especially to articulate this shared culture, to strengthen the Malayalam language as a vehicle, which would kind of anchor the sense of belonging of people born in this region, and development as the state's major language of unifying people. Now, if you think about, I don't want to talk about that long history, that's a whole different lecture perhaps, but now how many years? More than 70 years down the line, what we would think, what stares us in the face is the fact that each of these pillars is seriously deteriorated. And development for the weaknesses of these pillars have been exposed. We now know that the Kerala culture that was so celebrated in the middle of the 20th century was not as inclusive as it looked like at that point. The Malayalam language is facing challenges as Malayalis become a more migrant population. And development, welfareist development itself is becoming, the left itself is starting to abandon welfareist development, and it's no longer really a unifying force. In fact, the most divisive of debates, if you just go back a couple of years and see which were the most divisive debates, those debates were around development. So we need to think about the region in a different way now. We cannot rely on the mid-20th century consensus anymore. We need to rethink the region in a way that actually salvages us as a cultural entity. But at the same time, we don't want to close our eyes to any of the faults of these pillars, of the three pillars. I mean, we know that the Kerala culture has been often very elitist and Savarna We know that development has not really been fair to people who are deprived and abjected. We also know that the Malayalam language itself is shot through and through with elitist concerns. Now, we don't want to shut our eyes to all that. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to throw the region away completely and say that, okay, we are not even a region, we are nothing. So that doesn't look like viable to me. So I think it's very important. And I think examining the history of cosmopolitanisms in 20th century Kerala is an interesting way to start a reimagination of the region in less narrow terms. So in a way that will allow us to acknowledge the failings of 20th century regionalism, but at the same time, maybe reimagine the region in a way that is more inclusive. Yeah. So now this is my favorite map of Kerala. It is actually a drawing from a women's magazine called Srimati, which used to be published in the 1930s. It was a black and white image. So when I got this scanned, the guy in this photo studio was so, he was so taken by this image. He put the colors on it. I didn't. So, but then that the cassava, etc., were already there in the black and white image. He just put the gold on it. Well, you will notice, this is a very, very interesting image, because actually it should not be, I put it this way only for you to get a sense of the map. But if you look carefully enough in the waves, it's actually a map. You can see the place names marked. You can see that Kollam, and you can see the place names marked on the coast. Now, if you put it vertically, you will see it will be very peculiar, because you have Kerala, which has turned away from India. And its legs are pointed to the north. And where is it looking? It is looking, its gaze is northwesterly. So it is looking at the Gulf. And that's where the Gulf countries are. So very, very prescient kind of image, it's almost prophetic. So Kerala Madhava is gazing at the Gulf, So as if she knows that the money is going to come from there, I don't know what. No, but I think this is a very interesting imagination. It comes from the 1930s. Somehow it comes from, there is in it a kind of a recognition that Kerala has this, connection towards the sea. And it is true, if you think about it. Take the 17th century or the 18th century. Now, Kochi and Kuala Lumpur are, I think, around 1,800 miles away from kilometers via sea. And Kochi and Delhi are separated by around the same, I think, 1,500 kilometers or so. Now, it was easier to get to Kuala Lumpur in the 16th century than to Delhi. Because by ship, you travel to Kuala Lumpur by ship. Whereas if you wanted to get to Delhi, you would have to cross the impenetrable Sahya, forests on the Sahya mountains. And those forests were truly, truly devastating, truly, truly daunting for any traveler, until modern technology made it possible to cut down, build roads and clear forests and so on. So this meant that we're actually closer to Southeast Asia than to North India. And I don't know how many of you know this, Trivandrum is closer to Colombo than it is to Calicut, as the crow flies. So that way, the Kerala, this region called Kerala is poised in a way that keeps it open to the sea. And this is something that we need to really take into account. Can we move on to the next slide? Yes. Yes, so, from historically, Kerala has been a trade-oriented society, but very highly caste-based. So you have, on the one hand, you have a society that's rigidly divided into castes and which employs not just untouchability but also unseeability. And that is what was employed to keep society going here, the caste society going in Kerala. But at the same time, it was a society of seafarers, so trade was a great and important source of wealth for a very, very long period. So we have all kinds of sayings, like for example, this Chere thinnunna nattil poyal nadugandam thinnanam. There is a saying, which means if you go to a land of rat snake eaters, eat the middle piece. Which means you have to mingle, you should not think of any of your own culture or your own customs or habits. You should just adopt the customs and habits of others, even if they look very strange to you. Maybe you have never eaten a rat snake in your life. Maybe your culture forbids you to do that, but you will still do that. You still have to do it if you go to another place. That is the kind of folk wisdom offered to travelers in Kerala, in this region. Kerala, of course, is very recent. I keep using the word Kerala only to refer to the stretch of land which is full of Malayalam speakers and share a common heritage. Then, you must have also heard of this other proverb, a kind of comparison which says, "Kura Bengalathu poya pole." This is about the cockroach who went to Bengal. The cockroach hopped on a ship and went to Bengal. I mean, there was a very active trade in rice between Bengal and Kerala, and that Travancore particularly. So the ships filled with rice would come from Calcutta to Kochi and Calicut. So the idea is that some cockroach jumped into the hold of the ship and went to Bengal and ate a lot of rice. And then went to Bengal, and then came back in the same ship. So there is this comparison is about people who do not change, though they have been abroad. So Kura Bengalathu poyathu pole is a way of describing people who have gone to foreign countries, seen a lot of different cultures and people, but they still remain the same. So now these are all parts of snippets of folk wisdom which actually tell us that we have been a people exposed to other cultures, other people, and there is a material culture common to Southeast Asia and the whole of South India, which we live very normally without even being conscious, and that is what I am calling the cosmopolitanism of objects. Now if you don't have to go, a traditional Kerala kitchen, it looks exactly like a traditional Malay kitchen. There is no difference, almost. Almost all the implements are the same. What we call China Chatti or China Bharani, China Katti, you'll see the same things in the Malay, Indonesian, Sri Lankan, Southeast Asian, even in Vietnam, even that entire region, there is a sharing of a material culture. And it's not surprising because this happens under the Portuguese trade period of the Portuguese and the Dutch, when Chinese goods circulated in this whole region. So it was not China that was directly exporting any of the stuff. It was the Portuguese who were facilitating the circulation of material objects. So what we think about as a pristine Kerala architecture, you will find even more pristine Kerala architecture in Minangkabau in Malaya. In fact, this guy Ranjit, if he wants to shoot any more of those old feudal films, he should go to Minangkabau. He'll find even more authentic Malayali, architecture over there. So actually it's not, so to become aware of that is I think it's an important solvent for any claims of an exclusivist notion of Malayali culture. So I'll pause that for a moment because I'm not going. I'll come back here. I want to tell you my whole thesis in this lecture is to say that this is really very important. This is what we need to keep in our minds. We have to realize that during the Dutch and Portuguese periods, particularly during the Dutch periods, many different kinds of people came to Kerala. So, for example, the Dutch never bought their own armies. They recruited Sri Lankan armies. So there were Sri Lankan forces that invaded Kerala, basically soldiers. When the Dutch captured Fort Kochi, they had captives. They took a lot of captives to Batavia in Indonesia, where those people married local women. And these were, of course, Luso Indians whom they took, who spoke Cochin Creole, Portuguese. They were taken to Malacca and Batavia, where they married local Indonesian women. And they were called, the Dutch called them Marjikers. And the Marjikers spoke the Creole Portuguese. The same group was brought back to Kerala later by the Dutch to fight the wars which ravaged the 16th century. Now, point is, if you look at these people, they don't look, if you look at the average, there are vivid descriptions of these soldiers in the Dutch archives, and they don't look any different from a Kerala warrior. The same, and it's every reason to think that they never went back. They probably, because they also had, in fact, the Dutch brought Hindu warriors, Hindu fighters from Bali, because only they knew how to burn down a temple correctly. And that's every reason to think that these guys may never have gone back to Bali, they might have. So all these claims of the purity of blood, which we say, like, Nayars are pure-blooded or Irava or whatever, all this is really nonsense. Because these are all these people, there has been widespread mixing at least in the 16th century, 17th century, and there is no reason that, in fact, absolutely no reason why we should think ourselves as some kind of a people united in blood and sharing some, blood, that blood has flowed from generation to generation in some state of, purity. There is absolutely no, and we need to keep that in mind if we want to open ourselves up, if we want to have a sense of belonging that is not rigid and inclusivist. Yeah, so all these things, the Kaili, the Kaili, for example, the Kaili, even the patterns in the Kaili, I don't know if anybody has studied that, the printed prints in the Kaili prints. They used to be directly imported from Indonesia. And then, very interestingly, the synthetic Kaili, which began to be produced in the Gulf countries, because for the Indonesian, Malaysian people who started working there, those Kailis reached Kerala through the Gulf route. So then you have iron implements, arak making, the technology of arak making circulated in this region since the 14th century at least. So all these, or tree climbing techniques. Do you know that the tree climbing techniques in Kerala are not that of Sri Lanka? That's what we would expect. The techniques that we use, we share with the island of Sunda in Indonesia. And in fact, the only Malayalam name for the toddy tapper, the Sanskritic name for the toddy tapper in Malayalam is Shaundigan. And Shaundigan literally means a native of Sunda. So all this is very interesting. But I want you to keep this in mind as I pass on to the next part of my presentation, which is on cosmopolitanisms and migration in the late 19th and 20th century Kerala. So can we go on to the next slide? Next one, please. This is like I got it wrong. Yeah, but I want to tell you that before we get into the 19th and 20th centuries, even before that, we did have forms of cosmopolitanism. What I explained to you was this lived cosmopolitanism that came through trade. But there were other kinds of cosmopolitanism in pre-modern Kerala, which especially associated with the Catholic Church. And the reason is, Kerala, besides being a great center of trade, was also the center of world religions. So if you look at the three major religions, the founding myths around the three major religions, all of them claim to be, the representative of that religion in Kerala claims to be close to the founder, one of the founding heads of that faith. For example, for caste Hindus, the myth of Parashurama. Parashurama is Vishnu himself. So Kerala is supposed to have been founded by Mahavishnu himself. Then, if you look at, say, the Christian myths, the association is with St. Thomas, nothing less than that, who is, of course, one of the founding figures of the Christian faith. Or for Islam, again, a figure like Malik Dinar or many other, the first generation Muslim missionaries, they were all supposed to have been the companions of the founder of the faith, Prophet Muhammad. So, that claim is very important because that claim connects this local region with the founding place of that faith, whichever it is. So, in fact, Islam Islam and Christianity in Kerala, these connections grew richer over time. You can see that there is excellent research going on about Islam's cosmopolitan links, especially the Indian Ocean connections of Kerala's Islam in Kerala. There is also excellent work on the cosmopolitanism of the early Christian cosmopolitanisms of. Again, there's a lot of interesting material one could share here, but I just want to point out to one, which is the first travelogue in Malayalam called Vartamana Pustakam by two scholars we know, that is Paramakel Thoma Kathanar and Karyatil Yosef Malpan. They undertook this journey in the 18th century, and these were extraordinary people. They were great scholars. Malpan himself he was a student in Rome in between 1755 and 1765, and he was well versed in Latin, Portuguese, Italian, Malayalam and Tamil. And Thoma Kathanar himself was a great scholar of Sanskrit, Syriac, Tamil, Portuguese and Latin. So these were extraordinarily accomplished people. And their travel, interestingly, is they go from here to Madras and then take a ship which goes to Cape of Good Hope in Africa, and then they set sail for Europe, but there is a storm takes them to South America, so they land up in Bahia. They live in Bahia for a year, and then take another ship to Lisbon, and then from Lisbon they go to Rome. And the Vartamana Pustakam is the story of that trip to Rome. Now, this was also, this Vartamana Pustakam is also an important book because it shows that despite the cosmopolitanism that these two scholars, clergymen actually display, they were also acutely aware of how unequal it is. So they were actually going to Rome to petition the Pope against the Portuguese clergy, which was creating a great deal of trouble for them. And so many of the things that they point out to the Pope are very interesting. In fact, there's a passage there which says that we were already Christians when you were running around in your grass skirts in Europe. Or something like this, saying most of these churches and the big parishes among them have been built before your forefathers heard anything about Malabar. So it's like clearly saying that, cosmopolitanism requires, if you're talking about Christian cosmopolitanism, then you better be aware of the fact that you have to practice this. This equality has to come not because of white skin. And they clearly talk about white skin and say that we don't care for your white skin. Your white skin does not, give you the right to boss over us. So these are things that this book says. However, there are also problems with celebrating this cosmopolitanism. So like I told you, we are interested in this topic because we want to think of resources for the present. Now, is this a great resource for the present? I would think not. partly because and why, if you ask me, it's because this is clearly cosmopolitanism. In this kind of cosmopolitanism is talking about cosmopolitanism of the clergy, not of Christians. So the duo are very upset when a Portuguese priest treats them kind of sort of shabbily on their way to Chennai, to Madras, putting them up in a common inn with ordinary people. So they say that we are not ordinary people. So so this is not really there is a, what should I say, in that complaint by Malpan, there is a sharp tinge of casteism, which insists that the clergy are high and mighty and above, and they should not be put among ordinary people. So therefore, this is not, I'm not trying to idealize this, I am actually trying to develop a critique of this. So can we go to this next slide? Yes. So this pre-modern kind of cosmopolitanism, I think we should be very careful in trying to celebrate it. Somebody like Ashish Nandi, for example, talks about Kochi as a prime example of non-Eurocentric cosmopolitanism, but I think this cosmopolitanism which Kochi is celebrated for, where you had Jews and Muslims and Christians and everyone living together in the same space, I would call it casteist cosmopolitanism, because these groups were actually integrated into the caste order here. They were not just living as cosmopolitans, they were living here as caste groups. And the kingdom of Kochi was clearly ruled by a majoritarian, basically a king who was committed to defending the caste order. The Savarna king of Kochi, the Savarna regime of Kochi, was committed to defending the caste order, and each of these communities were integrated into the caste order as Vaishya, and there was no indigenous Vaishya, so these other communities filled that gap. And so I would call it the casteist cosmopolitanism. But at the same time, it erased other subaltern cosmopolitanisms which did exist here. For example, those of the Parangis. The Parangis of Kochi are an interesting group, not just because they are a mixture of Portuguese and local. No, they are not. Actually, they are, they are the descendants of people from Indonesia and, that Pegu, Indonesia, Malaysia, who were brought here in the 16th century by the Portuguese as boat builders and carpenters and so on. It was their descendants who became the Parankis, who then who married locally and settled down locally. Of course, they also intermarried with the Portuguese. So the real cosmopolitans here are the Paranki. But the Paranki, how many people have even really know anything about Parangi culture, and no one celebrates them as cosmopolitans. So they would be the subaltern cosmopolitans, which is erased by this discourse of casteist cosmopolitanism, which is supposed to have flourished in pre-modern Kerala. And of course, what do we celebrate? We celebrate the cuisine cosmopolitanism, which is the food. And that's because it is eminently sellable in terms of tourism. So then, now with that critique, let me just move on to looking at the cosmopolitanism of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. So what is the context? The context of these cosmopolitanism really is the coming of British rule into Kerala and the integration of the local economy into the capitalist world systems. So the products of Kerala are now being traded in the global world system, and Kerala becomes a producer of raw materials valued in the world economy. For example, coconut-based products attain a great deal of market value in the late 19th century. And communities that were highly invested in coconut cultivation, like the Irava, begin to profit from it. The British domination in Kerala, of course, brings modern missionaries here, and they begin to offer education to the lowest classes.
Then the 19th century was also a time of vast expansion of opportunities for migration, because the British Empire started setting up plantations, especially rubber plantations, for example, in Malaya and Sri Lanka, tea in Sri Lanka, tea and rubber in Sri Lanka, rubber in the Malaya Peninsula, and which needed a large number of laborers. And in fact, in the 1860s, I've seen a letter from a collector in the Palakkad district desperately writing to Madras, the authorities in Madras, saying that something must be done to stop the conversion of the lower caste agricultural laborers, because what they're doing is they're all converting into Islam, and then there are these little offices set up all over the Palakkad district, which are recruiting laborers for the Malaya Peninsula. So the lower caste, young men of the lower caste communities are converting into Islam, going to these recruitment centers and taking the ship to Malaya. So clearly, this was an opportunity for Dalits in Malabar particularly to escape the terrible torments of caste exploitation in Kerala and move to Malaya. And of course, Sri Lanka, so the educated, some of the educated upper caste men who were annoyed by their families, who had quarreled with their families, found the opportunity to run away to these other places and find work. And you probably know, I mean, many of you who have studied Malayalam cinema know that the first film, Vigada Kumaran, the plot unfolds in two places. So part of the plot unfolds in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, and part of it in Trivandrum. It is about a child who is kidnapped from a family in Trivandrum and taken to Sri Lanka. So, that way the opening up of global geography through trade brings many opportunities. Then, of course, a very vast spread, because these plantations are sugar plantations in Fiji. All of this attract labor from this region. Then the spread of modern education among the elites, so people get to know more and more. And not only the elites, for example, the CMS missionaries, the early efforts in education. So when they discuss caste, they bring in texts like the writings of Booker T. Washington on American slavery, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, etc. So lower caste people are exposed to the world at large and begin to recognize the oppression that they suffer as no longer just a local phenomenon. And so then the modern at this point emerges as a possibility to defy traditional authority, to find alternative ways of living, to escape caste oppression, and to gain some self-reflexivity, and that is what presents itself as the modern at this stage. Can we move the slide, please? Yes. So if you look at the early 20th century, so much of which is so blandly identified as part of Kerala Navodhanam, which is a very misleading word, consists of exogenous arrivals. So the first generation feminists, for example, are talking about suffragist struggles in London. In fact, in 1903, there is Lakshmi Amma in Trivandrum is writing about how unfair the British Prime Minister is for having unleashed the police on the suffragists and beaten them up, and how that is very important for women in Travancore to understand. So you have the first generation, and women like Kochatal Kalyani Kuttiyamma in the 1930s are completely, I mean, their sense of identification with the local is actually weakens in a huge, to a huge extent, and they do not simply believe themselves to be subject to the local patriarchies. So that defiance of local patriarchy is so unique it can only be described as the mental a mindset that is focused on the world rather than on the region. Then the anti-caste missionary network, as I just mentioned, who introduced Booker T. Washington and anti-caste literature from the American scene here. Then the rationalism of Sahodaran K. Ayyappan and others, which actually draw on American rationalism. And in fact, Ayyappan had a very, very strong correspondence with American rationalists in the 1930s and 40s. Then, of course, there was Buddhism by C. Krishnan and others in Malabar, and C. Krishnan actually was in close touch with Buddhists from Thailand onwards. Thailand, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and so on. And there was an active communication between these regions and this region, the area of Kerala at that time. Then we all, of course, know of the literary cosmopolitanism of figures like Kesari Balakrishna Pillai. Kesari Balakrishna Pillai, who kind of rejected the British literature as inferior and looked at the continental literature, who introduced literary theory and aesthetic theory into Malayalam and completely revolutionized Malayalam literature, literally pulling very hard at its Sanskritic roots and making this whole idea of making it modern was firmly planted in Malayalam literature by him. Then, of course, Marxism, socialism, all of which comes in the first half of the 20th century. And again, it is Marxism as an ideology comes from Europe, as we all know. But as I told you, it had its own version of cosmopolitanism. And so A.K. Gopalan, for example, was a wanted revolutionary not just in India. He was also wanted by the police in Malaya and Sri Lanka, because he traveled in those regions organizing labor there. In Sri Lanka, he traveled extensively in Sri Lanka to end the animosities between Sinhala labor and Malayali labor. Because there were accusations that these Malayali men were just, marrying Sinhala women and then abandoning them and so on. And AKG actually traveled in that region to settle disputes and to actually bring together the labor force. So A.K. Gopalan was a wanted man in not just British India. He was also wanted in Malaya and Sri Lanka. And I mean, old Ceylon, that is, in Ceylon. So if that was cosmopolitan, so a large share of what we realize as Malayali Navodhanam, which we believe is mostly endogenous, was not. It was not endogenous, it was exogenous. In fact, even a poet like Ashan, who we all would think was endogenous, whose work is endogenous, is not. Because if you look at his major poems, long poems, the themes of those poems are drawn not from some endogenous source. They are drawn from all over India, and some are based on Persian myths, some are from Buddhism, and other sources. So what appears to be endogenous is not so, and we have still not acknowledged that. So we still conceive of Navodhanam as Malayali Renaissance. And what is Renaissance? Renaissance is the rediscovery of a buried culture. So it is imagined in endogenous terms. It is not. My contention is that if at all we should use that term in the Malayali context, it has to be understood as essentially a confluence of all these different kinds of forces, cultural forces, that are exogenous. And what is the nature of migration in this period? As I told you, there was a massive opening up of opportunities, especially for the subaltern poor, to migrate. But the point is, this changes. In the 1920s, for example, the migration of poor laborers is actually begins to fall, and instead educated Malayalis are now moving towards Malaya, especially Malaya Peninsula. So you will notice, I mean, many of you might have noticed in your own environs, there's so many houses in Kerala. Somebody should do a photo exhibition on that. There are houses called Ipoh Cottage, Penang Villa, Malaya Cottage. I mean, so many. And in fact, I have seen a house called Bungaraya. And Bungaraya in Malaya means a chemberati, a hibiscus flower. So, so many of the houses here are named after places. Houses that were built in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, modern homes, were named after the places from which the wealth to produce those homes were produced. So you had the elite, an elite stream of migration now. Of course, the subaltern stream preceded it. It was already there. So you will see that there's a difference. If you look at the literature, you'll see that there's a difference in the way these two streams related to home. The elites were much closer to home. So, the elites also, when after the Second World War, most of the elites returned. The elites had enough salaries, resources, networks, connections to marry among each other, marry elites. And they were, the INA, for example, recruited mostly the highly educated Malayali elite who were working in Malaya at that time. And if you read the autobiography of Nair San, well-known Nair San, who ended up in Japan as a student, and then he could not come back, and then became well-known as a nationalist and a supporter of Rash Bihari Bose and other Indian revolutionaries. Stayed in Tokyo all his life, never returned to India. And it's very interesting, they had to choose a side. So you can see K.P. Keshav Menon, for example, returned to India and became a famous nationalist. Whereas James Joseph Puducherry was also recruited in the INA, and he was one of the few INA people who actually survived, who went back after the Battle of Imphal. So he returned to Malaya and became one of the most respected socialist politicians in Malaysia. And he became a very well-known economist as well. His whole family, his son Janil Puducherry was a politician. His grandson, his son Dominic Puducherry, was a very well-known trade unionist in Malaysia. So you can see they had to choose. James Puducherry, of course, his father was a Malayali. He went to Malaya in the 1920s as a translator, and then he became an excise officer. And James Puducherry was raised in Malaya and became a Malaysian. And in fact, that whole family is invested very heavily in Malaysian politics. But these are all elites. Can we move the slide, please? But there is another group, which are the migrant, what I call the migrant subalterns, who did not choose one nation or the other. Then if you want to read more about them, you should read S.K. Pottakad's fabulous travelogue in Southeast Asia, where he meets a number of these migrant subalterns. So, for example, he meets this guy called Harry Joseph, who left Kerala when he was 11 years old. He was an orphan and mistreated by his father's family. So he took a ship. He ran away from home and took a ship from French Pondicherry, Nagapattinam, for Malaysia. And he worked, he grew, he was raised in the rest of his life, or till youth, he took refuge in a mosque in Penang, where they educated him and, taught him some skills, with which he worked all the way between Laos to Indonesia, settled down in Indonesia, married a Sumatran Muslim, and when Pottakad met him, he was a fairly rich contractor. He was actually a rich local contractor, a road builder, who had 5 daughters, all named after heroines of Bengali novels. And in his house, his wife knew how to make a perfect sambar, Pottekad was served to Sumatran food as well as Malayali food. And Pottekad is absolutely amazed by the ease with which he moves across cultural registers. There is no tension. There is no sense of hierarchy between these registers. He's able to be a Sumatran, a Laotian, a Malayali, all together, and there is no contradiction, and there is no play acting, nothing. So he's called the real Vishwapauran, who's able to, treat borders as completely irrelevant. Then there is Narayana Pillai, who he meets in Jakarta, who left Trivandrum as a Sanskrit scholar, but there he attained a great grasp of Bahasa Indonesia, and he was publishing a bilingual newspaper there. So one sheet in Malayalam and the other sheet in Bahasa. Then he also meets a senior man who ran a very successful hotel, restaurant in Jakarta, which was named the Malabar Pakistan Hotel. And on being questioned about this strange name, he told Pottekad that Malabar is my native place and Pakistan is my faith. So Malabar Pakistan Hotel. Then, of course, and there's the number of, there are many people whom he discusses, but I'm just choosing a few. Then he meets this girl called Kamala. And Kamala is very Chinese, but she was raised as a Malayali, because when the Japanese attacked Malaya, the Chinese workers in the plantations ran away. And when they ran away, they left behind, they took only their boys. They left all their girl children behind. And the managers and supervisors of these plantations were mostly in Malayali Indians, most Tamils and Malayalis, and they took pity on these girls and basically adopted them. So I myself met a family of, where the senior lady is called Sarojini Amma, and the youngest is a very well-known lawyer in Penang, Lalita. Her name is Lalita Menon. And four sisters, all Malayali, perfect Malayalam, but except the fact that they're all Chinese, actually by birth. 4 Chinese children, they were babies, adopted by a childless Malayali couple. If you read Pottekad's famous story, Avaluda Keralam, where he says that this whole idea of Kerala as a shared homeland was actually produced outside Kerala. So he talks about an Onam celebration in Penang, I think, where people from North, Kasaragod, and people from Kanyakumari and all kinds of people are there, and they imagine it's through their eyes that this Kerala is born. Yeah. So basically the cosmopolitanism of this time is the ability to absorb 2 or more cultural worlds, basically to maintain different cultural registers in your mind without getting them into a conflict. So there's no conflict, there's no question of choosing. So if Harry Joseph is asked to, and in fact, by the time Pottekad has met him, Harry Joseph is in the process of trying to process his Indonesian citizenship. So some people are accusing him of not being Indonesian. So you see, the point is he was now being forced to choose a side. Earlier he did not have to do it. So the thing about colonial geography, within colonial geography, it was possible. You know why? Because someone who migrated from Kerala to Malaya, Kerala was under the British, so was Malaya. So Malayali people did not have citizenship. The Malaya people also did not have citizenship. So someone moving from here to there were equal. They were equal with the local folk. They were both equally under the British. So this kind of sharing was possible. But what happens afterwards changes this completely. So in the second half of the 20th century, our migration changes, and when our migration changes, so also the nature of cosmopolitanism. Yeah. So
as I told you, the effects of this cosmopolitanism, which can carry different registers, cultural registers, without making, arranging them in some hierarchy. First of all, this is about modernity, as modernity is understood as a critique on rebellion against traditional forms of power. So even elites like N.N. Pillai, for example, ran away from his Tharawad. People who migrated are very often runaways. They are running away from power, even elites. Then social capital is not understood as some local business, of creating local networks, etc. It's about being able to imagine a larger connect. So even the Panchayat president who comes to put to clean wells with potassium permanganate will give this big speech on, in Soviet Union all the wells are, so Soviet those kind, the imagining of a world that is much bigger than your local, that you belong to that kind of a world. Then the openness to the world as a virtue, not as the other way around. So people who were soldiers, for example, in Kerala in the First World, from this region, the First World War, coming back with very defiant attitudes and refusing to acknowledge their former landlords and so on. And of course, this was often at loggerheads with Indian nationalism, because, Indian nationalism wanted you to essentially pick a side, to say that your Indian identity is primary, it's above everything else. But of course, it did not. The point is that at no point did this translate into some kind of uncritical nationalist sentiment. That was the great advantage, in my view, of the cosmopolitanisms of this time. Yeah, then of course, in the 1940s and 50s, as you all know, the world politics changes after the Second World War. So you have the nation-state system coming into being with decolonization, the entire world, all the world being divided into nation-states. All of them have immigration, they have passport system. So you are no longer, if you migrate to another country, you are not a citizen there. You cannot be on equal terms with the local people. So it is not like the pre-nation-state system. So, you cannot just, excuse me, can I have some water, please? So you can't really migrate from Kerala to Malaya and be really equal with the people. The people there think that they are superior because they are actually citizens of that place. Then there is the Cold War. So the Cold War changes you have to be either with the American pole or with the Soviet pole. And Marxism, of course, this is internationalism, and internationalist cosmopolitanism is now fixed around the USSR's pole. So it's all fine, but USSR is central to it. Now, Buddhism, again, which people like C. Krishnan wanted to experiment with, gets identified with Dalai Lama and Tibet and China and so on. Then you have, rationalism. Therefore, rationalism becomes atheism. So the anti-caste, anti-power kind of orientation is strongly there. In the earlier evocations of rationalism are now gone. Then feminism, of course, is now really forced to be under nationalism. So feminists are told that they have to be nationalist first. So they have to be Indian, not in some ways international. So Indian culture you have to take into account. So the first generation of feminists in India also give up, for example, reservations for women, the demand for reservations for women, because they are convinced that that kind of a demand is really anti-national. Then the only exception you can say that this reversal you did not see was in the Malayali literary public, where we still were talking about the fascination with continental European literature continued. So Kafka and Camus and all these other figures became very important, continued to be very important to us. So can you move the slide? Yeah. So along with this, you also see some new trends in migration. And for example, post-World War II, Europe is utterly devastated, and there is a resurgence of Catholic cosmopolitanisms, which is very elite, okay? There was a very interesting proposal to move Kerala Catholic farmers to Brazil, through the church. In fact, 12 families from Kerala actually migrated to Brazil at that time. Of course, that didn't work out, which is another matter. Nobody went after that. But in Europe, needed a lot of nurses, basically medical and paramedical personnel. And the Catholic Church mediated the migration of a very large number of nurses to Germany, to Italy, to France, Switzerland, and the European countries. There was a flow of teachers through the Catholic Church again to African countries, Ethiopia, Nigeria, wherever oil money could pay substantial salaries. And of course, from the 1970s onwards, we know that the Gulf opens up a window of opportunity. The petrodollar crisis opens up a window of migration of semi-skilled labor from Kerala into the Persian Gulf. Now, this is this migration is very different in nature from the first wave that we've just discussed. Now here, this seems to be animated completely by a completely different ethos of family. For example, the ethos of family is very, very important. Dutifulness to family is very important here, because you have and family, community, because I told you Catholic mediation was important. But even when there was no mediation, like for example the Gulf migration, which happened purely through networks, individual networks. So even there, the support of family, community, caste, religion was very, very important. And you can see that this actually leads to a strengthening of these local power structures. So conservatisms are some way refurbished, not undone. If the earlier kind of cosmopolitans undid local power, these actually reinforce it. And the aim of in this migration, the major aim is really the family upward mobility through status securing consumption. So people are migrating to Nigeria, for example, or Gulf to get a better salary to remit home. So this is transnational, This is hardly running away from home and settling in another country and acquiring a new identity. It's not that. This is transnational. You're just moving to another country where they pay better salaries so that you can send more money back home and facilitate higher consumption by your family. And so these people are interesting because they are politically marginal in the host land. The earlier generation was not like that. Now in Malaysia, if you go to Kuala Lumpur, is a huge building which houses the offices of the trade unions. The name of that building, if I remember right, was P.V. Narayanan Memorial Building. And P.V. Narayanan was a worker from Kannur who migrated to Malaysia and built one of the largest trade unions there. So not politically quiescent, which is in sharp contrast to the post-1950s migrations, where you have Malayalis essentially being the good subjects, the quiescent, quiet subjects, politically docile subjects in the host land. So there are similarities, no doubt, because both have waves of poor migrants, and there are poor migrants who are going. But look at the differences. The differences are very striking. So the new wave migrants are poor, but they have already benefited from the Kerala model achievements. So they have basic education. Their health is much better than the first generation migrants who left. Then the first wave, the Dalit presence, including the lower caste, in fact I shouldn't use the word Dalit, I would say Avarna presence was very strong. The Dalit Avarna presence, as I told you, Dalits often converted into Islam and ran away from the caste order here. They could do that. But in the second wave, that is minimal. In fact, you actually find that among the communities of Kerala, it is the Dalits who have not been able to migrate, in comparative terms. Then the second wave migrants had no chance of settling in the host land. They had to come back. So transnational migration became the rule rather than the exception. And of course, they were sharply divided from the locals in the host land because they could never be citizens there. Then again, here in the second wave, the driving force is family status mobility and not the defiance of power or any of those concerns. And of course, and following on this, you can see that the second wave migrants are very dependent on family, community, resources and networks. Very often this migration is funded by selling family property. It is the family who takes over the financial burden of supporting the migration process itself, unlike the first generation, where people ran away from the house and somehow got on a boat. Yeah. So, but then in the late 20th century, there are cosmopolitanisms in our in the cultural political horizon of Kerala, which doesn't come from migration, which comes through networks of culture. So you have feminism, for example, late 20th, in the first feminist evocations of politics in Kerala come in the 1980s, and they come from Indian feminism and inspired by feminism elsewhere. Environmentalism, for example, again is a worldwide concern. There's a whole network of global movements, which environmentalism in Kerala also finds itself to be part of. So there is the anti-caste politics, which is actively now connecting with the anti-race politics in other parts of the world. Then there's the new Marxism of the 1980s, which was Euro-Marxism, Sachidanand and Rajivan generation, which also thought themselves as the new radical Marxist cosmopolitan who were interested in Latin American literature, in European cultural theory, and so on. And the new Islamic thought that is been flowering since the 1990s in Kerala, after the Muslim migration began to bring resources into the Muslim communities in Kerala. And the literary public sphere, of course, remains as cosmopolitan. So if there is a Latin American novel which is a hit, then within like 3 months you have a Malayalam translation of it in Kerala. If you go into the bookstores, you would think that Kerala is like absolutely unbelievably cosmopolitan. But if you visit, it's funny because in the public sphere we are all great cosmopolitans until we go back home. Mm-hmm. So, and that contradiction is explained, I think, by this history. And then, of course, there are good and bad here. There's good and bad. All globalized versions of these politics is not good. Feminism, for example, in Kerala is deeply under the sway of what I call global governance feminisms, which is very elitist, which actually reworks elitism in ways that are completely unfavorable to the poor. For example, POCSO, the child sex abuse law, is used most frequently. In fact, that is the way it is. It is used most frequently against tribal men, against the most powerless men. And in fact, it is the tribal men who marry according to customary law, etc. And those are not forced marriages, but nevertheless, the women they marry are underage according to the state. And so it's those men who go to jail who are punished. So I don't know if that is great, but so I'm saying that we need a local feminism, not just a global feminism. And there is a struggle to then attain a balance between the good and bad and what appears to be universal and so on. So, yeah. So, what we have then in the final analysis, if you look at this 20th century and try to distill the essence of what transpired, we have two different senses of the modern. You have modern as questioning power, which is liberatory. Then you have, that is the early 20th century sense of the modern, associated with marginalized groups, which is very suspicious of universals, but also aspiring for global connections and so on. And the second is of modern, of high consumption, combined with the ethos of community. So what makes the second, what makes you modern in the second half of the 20th century? It is your access to modern things. It's your consumption. It's no longer the kind of ideas that you espouse, like it was in the earlier part of the century. when to be modern was to question power, to question community, bring new senses of liberation, and so on. But in the second part of the 20th century, it's not any of that. It has to do with consumption, with family upward mobility, and of course, this is a modernity that seems to be highly invested actually in culture and tradition. So you have high consuming individuals buying up temples and trying to organize, religious festivals and trying to revive old feudal customs and so on. And they are, of course, in the second order, this whatever claims to be modern is politically conservative and subservient to all these neoliberal regimes. So this is the legacy of the 20th century. So I want to basically take your attention back to the cosmopolitanism of things that I mentioned in between, of objects. I mean, I think the most important thing here is to remember that the manner in which we connect to the world shapes our understanding of our cosmopolitanism, how we relate to the world. So that's one thing. So it is in some sense a very transient, to identify with one or the other depends on the times that you live in a way. But I don't think we should forget at all the fact that our everyday lives, the kind of things that surround us in our everyday lives, do not belong to any one place. I mean, what you would think has 100% Malayali, it's not 100% Malayali at all. Historically, the kaili that you wear, the designs from those kaili, they are from Indonesia perhaps, or they are from Malaysia. They are not from around here. You may think it is from here. Only that the same garment is given a different name. Or the food that you eat, the kind of the house that you live in, even the words that we use. So these are all things that actually have come from somewhere. And they have found a temporary, anchoring in our place. So I think the moment we become aware of this, I mean, we live this in a manner immersed. We live immersed in that kind of cosmopolitanism. When we are in our kitchen and grinding our chamandi, we don't even know that some woman in Sri Lanka or somebody in Malaysia is also doing the same, with the same instrument. The same style of cooking. Meen dala curry. You will find meen dala curry in Kuala Lumpur or Penang, the same meen dala curry, only that it has a different name. And you know that meter chaya, the famous Malabar meter chaya, that is a national drink of Malaysia, the meter chaya. Not the ordinary tea, the meter chaya. They pride in that and they believe that it belongs to them. While we all know that this is like all over Malabar. It went from Malabar. It's essentially the Malabaris who took it to Malaysia. So in some sense, almost all parts of our culture are permeated by exogenous factors. And we are so immersed in it, we don't remember it. I think when we become aware of it, that is when our sense of belonging matures and becomes richer. And that is when I think we can escape the clutches of Hindutva, and which says that, okay, everything is Hindu and it proceeds from Varanasi or something like that. I mean, which erases regions totally. And we can also then resist the exoticization of parts of Malayali culture as essentially coming from Portugal or some place or the other. It's not even that. In fact, we can resist both these poles. We can actually think about our everyday lives as essentially shared among so many different peoples. And that, I think, makes us a richer, much more richer, open, and people who are able to reflect on our change. And in fact, I chose this topic for today's talk because I think that the series, the general series, and also the other work that institutions like the museum should be doing should be to take us towards that kind of a culture, which is not exclusivist and is constantly open to change and welcoming of all things good. So I will stop there, and sorry for taking so much time, but this was the too many things I had to say. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll be moving to the Q&A session. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. Ashutosh or I will pass you the microphone.
Hi, ma'am. Wonderful lecture. Just wanted to add something. It's a linguistic expression that I had come across in my PG years. One of my friends in Kochi, he actually asked this, "Nee edu penangir poi kadakana." Like there was this expression that he used, and I just thought of that when you were saying about that. Just adding something. And there is this Kerala chicken curry is now apparently very famous in Japanese manga comics for some reason. I don't know why, but it's like very famous in graphic prints and all that.
By the way, you know that Kerala paratha,
Yeah.
the so-called Kerala parota.
Yes.
That is in it's called murtaba in Indonesia, and roti prata in Singapore, and it is the national food of Malaysia. So so it's a little confusing. The Kerala parota being the national food of Malaysia. So I am so glad for those kinds of confusions. I think that's what keeps us human still.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think there was so much to think about. But I think the main question that came up was the idea of authenticity, right? And that's something that everyone is so concerned about now. The idea of authenticity.
Yes.
What I'm eating, is that authentic Japanese food? What I'm eating, is it authentic Malayali parota? And now to hear that the idea of authentic is flawed because it doesn't exist is such a
Relief.
in a sense, yeah. And I don't know what to tell the influencers, but I was wondering how you would respond to something like that, the current search for the authentic.
Yes, it's very worrying, is it not? Because it could end up with some kind of jingoism or the other. Because either it can be and we know, I think the best thing that happened to us was we did not have a Vaishya community here. The caste Hindus here did not have Vaishya. So that had to be filled up by the Christians and the Jews and the Muslim. So this is one reason why the Muslims cannot be othered here. It's so difficult. Everybody is trying their hardest to other the Muslims in Kerala. Everyone from the right to the left to everybody I know is trying to somehow to peddle some kind of Islamophobia or the other. And I am the most famous Sudapini of Kerala, so I don't care. I really don't. I wear it like a badge of honor, because the point is everybody and why is that? Despite all these efforts, it's not possible, because for centuries the Muslims have been the Vaishyas of Kerala, and the trader community Muslims are, technically speaking, in that order upper caste. So they cannot be so easily dislodged from. So that's one reason why, despite the ardent efforts of the combined forces of left, right, center, everyone I know, literally, it's so difficult to happen. And I think we should really thank ourselves, for that it's not happening here like it is happening in other places.
Yeah, Devika. Interesting talk. Lots to read upon after this. But I wanted to ask you, there's one point which was like little, I was confused about. You put the migration to a Gulf in the second category.
Yes.
Where the migration happens, but you're still connected to the route, which is Kerala. But in Gulf migrations also, can you split this up into two categories, where the earlier migrations which happened were actually the kind of migrations that we talked about with the Penang migration, the Malay migration, where you go with and you have no roots at home at all?
Yeah, there is a little bit in the 60s, right? That's why I mentioned 1970s particularly. In the from the 1970s onwards, there is a change. But before the 1970s and 1960s, there used to be these boat people, who used to go.
Yeah.
But they're not a significantly large number. They are there, but they're not significantly large. And they are like the earlier generations, but they face the full might of the nation state now. So they are actually literally illegal. Earlier, it was not illegal. I mean, anyone running away could essentially...
But where would this category of people be, where would they identify with? Would they be part of the people who went and, they would...
They would, and in my mind, these people would be somewhere in between, There was an in-between period where the passport regimes were just taking shape. That is from the 1920s to roughly the 1960s. There was this in-between kind of phase where you could get caught and sent back if you got caught.
Yeah.
But you could easily not get caught. Like from India, if you boarded a ship from Nagapattinam or French Pondicherry, then you won't be caught. But if you try to pass through Madras, you might get caught. You might have to come back if the protector of immigrants thought that you are being trafficked. And for women, of course, no chance. But this is the in-between phase where you could slip through. You could still slip through, but you could also get caught. And the more the nation state becomes stronger, especially in terms of its machinery, its bureaucracy, the more difficult it is. So in the Gulf areas, it took a long time for that machinery to get into place. So in the 1960s, it was still possible for people to get on dhows and swim to the coast and live there. But they could definitely not marry local women that was a big difference. So, I believe that the Southeast Asian connection for Malayalam... Now, we have this west kind of complex.
In Oman,
we desperately want to be identified as trading with ancient Romans or Europeans or the Arabs at least. We are not even conscious of our connection with Southeast Asia, which is where we blended in. Where local women, it was possible to marry local women. The Arabs are very caste conscious. So,
but this kind of dangerous migration, if I may put it that way, that kind of migration, in your knowledge, has it happened anywhere else for us?
You mean like the Gulf?
Like the Gulf.
You mean this in-between
in-between culture where you are doing the...
actually, see,
breaking borders.
Yeah, 1950s is when actually the migration to Malaya begins to turn into a trickle, because there are more and more restrictions. You can only migrate if you earn above a certain amount of money. So a lot of migration still happened to Brunei and other parts where the oil extractions, they were building the oil extraction facilities and so on. But the poor people could not migrate anymore. So that began to be cut off steadily. And I think the Gulf was the last place where the poor could just hop on something it's not like perhaps what is happening to the boat people who are trying to reach Europe. They are refugees. And this is not being a refugee. This is just actually, in fact, there is the theory on cosmopolitan theory now actually looks at these labor migrations across the world and looks at it as evidence of how people naturally have this sense of world citizenship. So Malayalis never really had a sense of, and that is why if you look at Kerala's, the whole discourse of Kerala-centric discourses,
It's not like Tamil. In Tamil, Thaye, Tamile, Vanangiyana, Prasangam, even speech starts with an evocation of Tamil as the sacred core of Tamil culture. In Kerala, Malayalam does not have that status. In fact, that image that I showed you is an absolutely rare one. Whereas in Tamil Nadu, there are thousands of images of Tamil, the goddess of Tamil, the Tamil Nadu as this feminine deity. Whereas in Kerala, you will not find anything, very few. In fact, this is almost the only one. And it's a nice and quirky one, you think about it. But yeah, so in fact in Kerala, I have a paper on this. Literally, we are a people, it's the World Ecumenical Society's motto is a people united in Christ. So like we are a people, we were at least a people united in development. So Maveli, and that is why Maveli myth, the reinterpretation of the Maveli myth as Maveli is a welfare state. Maveli is really the deity of the welfare state. And Onam is really a reinterpretation. So in fact, that is the most brilliant cultural move, I think, the left ever made, to take Onam away from Trikakara and Trikakare and so on, the Brahmanical deities. And in fact, the victim Maveli became, the Asura Maveli became, was placed at the center of this new discourse. And who's that Maveli? He's the welfare state. And Onam becomes a national festival of Kerala. And so I've written on this, that we have different Onams. We have a Shoppy Onam, which is, buying up things. Then we have a Sharpy Onam, which is to... And we have a VP Onam, where everybody is crying about how wonderful it used to be in the old time. And all that. But the best Onam is the Sarkar Onam, where, you have all the folk artists, all the performers in Kerala can look forward to a regular income, The performances in Trivandrum, there are performances in all. Sometimes there's nobody there, but they're just performing. But they get a good. They're paid well, and the streets are all decorated. And for once, although there are no cars on those streets, you can actually walk on them, and it's a wonderful. The Sarkar Onam is really fabulous. So that was the smart move, So you moved, basically shuttled Vishnu out, and you got Maveli in, and that is what the BJP in Kerala is crying about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Nala, and I'm really glad that I came here because when we're imagining something for this world, something more kind and something more, unanimous as human beings. This is definitely a great way to think about it, and obviously tracing through my personal history, what I've seen growing up. My grandfather went to Ceylon, I'm also a Gulf product, but at the same time, where I think my spiritual void or whatever comes from is that because my migration was motivated by money, like my family's migration, I feel like I've not gained anything culturally from, the kind of anecdotes that you shared. This is my personal experience. And right now we are also talking a lot about diaspora going to like UK and becoming like hardcore staunch, like Hindu nationalists, when they're just sitting there and they don't know what's going on back home.
Totally, yeah.
So I'm trying to understand, how these two elements like power and money could disrupt this vision, because I just feel like it is creating a void in us that, we can't appreciate the kind of cultural exchanges that we share. And and this was there throughout nationalism, right? Like Gandhi went abroad to study, but he came back and he was like, no, we need to preserve the spiritual core of the nation. Partha Chatterjee also talks about a lot of these ideas where to dispel the foreign invaders, we need to preserve the spiritual core of the nation. We need to look back into authenticity. But right now I'm afraid that because, it's become increasingly neoliberal, very money-minded, the concept of authenticity is...
I totally understand your concern because, for example, if you look at the literary public, I have a book on this actually. Now, the Kerala's literary public is perhaps its most cosmopolitan part. But there was a time when that cosmopolitanism was shaped by political concerns, a concern for a better world and so on. Now it's driven by the market. It's still very cosmopolitan because Ravi DC regularly shops in Frankfurt Book Fair, I know. And he's looking at Latin American titles which have, sold really well, and he's like instantly connecting them to Malayali translators who do a bad job, terrible job, most of them. But then whatever, people love it. That's a whole bunch. And then you have bad writers trying to imitate that, like Hindu Menon's terrible books, which are all, trauma porn either trauma porn or drawing bad imitations of Latin American, sexual accounts of sex in Latin American novels. Very bad imitations of those. So it cuts either way. So problem is, there was a time when this. So at one point we were fascinated by France. Whole bunch of people were reading. I grew up in the 1980s in Trivandrum. I was a college student in Trivandrum. So funny, I remember there were people who used to studying German for the sake of reading Marx in the original German. So I said, okay, if this guy can be understood only if you read him in the original German, maybe he wrote only for the Germans, So why should we read him at all if that is the case? But I remember the shock with which this, I was just 18 or 19, and saying this was like shocking to see older people, because I thought these young, useless kids, saying nonsense. But it was a genuine doubt, So if somebody can be read only in their language, then maybe only their people should read them, Why should we read them? And there were people, of course, who were fascinated by existentialism and, and past is prime, by the way. Existentialism is long gone. Nobody was interested in existentialism anymore in the West, but we were still mulling about it, and there are reasons why we were mulling about it. But in the 70s and 80s and so on. And then in the 80s came the new generation of radical left cosmopolitans, so Sachidanandan and P. Rajiv and the ex-Naxalites. So they brought in Latin America, Africa, so large amounts of translations of African. So they wanted to revolutionize the Malayali literary canon by infusing this. Like at one point of time, Bengali literature was hugely translated into Malayalam, So then in the 80s you had Walsoinka and Enguki, so many African writers being translated into Malayalam. Also poets, especially poetry, particularly Latin American poetry, and combined with Euro-Marxism. So very interesting kind of cosmopolitanism. The theory rely on Europe, for literature rely on the South. Think about it. I'm writing a paper on it, and I'm still thinking about it. What that means. So for all your theoretical needs, shop in Europe. For all your literary needs, go to Africa and Latin America. So what does that mean is a moot question, actually. So you're right. You're concerned about this getting more and more common. Festivals, the literary festivals now, in fact, the literary festivals are, though you have some poor sod who's set up as the director of the festival, I know for sure that everything there is dictated by the market. So we are consumers, we like going from stall to stall, and I like it because, only reason why I endorse it is because those are the only places where there is no moral policing in Kerala. So it's a relief to see young people breathing, because otherwise you don't see young people breathing in Kerala. They are all they look like they have eyes all over their bodies. But at least in these spaces you actually see young people relaxing and even doing a bit of PDA. And it's nice to see human beings expressing themselves as human beings. So, so those are good reasons, but the reason, as you rightly pointed out, there's so much pressure from the market. So that is worrying, no doubt. And I think that is the best thing about a place like this. And I think the museum, for example, can do so much about, igniting genuine conversations that are not driven by the market.
So inescapable. Huh? Thank you so much.
Hello, ma'am. Shalja here. So I actually work at the museum also. So I actually saw you mention about the elite in Kochi, like the Jews and Christians and all. So recently I have been reading about the Parangis in general. So that's where I was able to distinguish the dichotomy between the Parangis who were living in the borders of Kochi, like some people even in Alapura. Actually, I was influenced by Francis Norona's book, Munda and Parangi. So, and the difference between the exoticized Anglo-Indian in Kerala, very much. So, what my doubt was like, whenever we look into this, why is this dichotomy not visible in academic spaces or even in discussion? Why is it like subalternized? Like, was there any monetary reason or a financial sort of supremacy behind it?
Yeah, sure. Actually, see, the Parangi were working class. They were working class right from the beginning. I mean, of course, when they came here, they were specialized artisans. In fact, they came right on the heels of the Portuguese. When Albuquerque returned from the conquest of Malacca in 1511, three shiploads of Parangi, I mean, later people who became Parangi, they were brought already. And they were the most highly paid artisans of the Sultan of Malacca. Of course, technically they were slaves, but as you know, the Asian slave is very different from the African slave. The only thing about the Asian slave is that they can work only for the government. That is the only thing. And they actually paid much more. And they're called slaves because they can work only for the government, essentially. But they are paid very well and trained excellently. So these were all slaves of the Malacca Sultan, and they were promised freedom if they converted to Christianity. So they got off the ship in Kochi and converted and became Christians. And they settled in all the islands around Fort Kochi. They were shipbuilders. In fact, till recent times, the major occupation was carpentry. Another boatload went to Kollam. Now, actually, I grew up there. I grew up in Tangasheri, which was an enclave, a Portuguese enclave, with a lot of Anglo-Indian kids. So I am right from my childhood, I've seen that dichotomy, because the Parangis live in a little corner of Tangasheri where they are essentially, they were boat builders, but they also make all kinds of furniture, and basically they are the furniture business. Some of them have made it well. And the Parangis in Kollam did much better than the Parangis in Kochi. So there were Parangis around Elur, for example, parts of Elur. They had settled in parts of Elur. So the little groups of Parangis who were all over the place, and they were essentially, and over time, those skills did not increase in value. Initially, they were of high value because in Kerala, woodwork was very poor. So people did not know how to make mesha and kasera, and all that. Those are Portuguese words. Alamara, mesha, kasera. All those are, and jannal itself is a Portuguese word. So, yes. So, to make these things, you needed people who knew how to make them. And these artisans knew, whereas woodworkers here did not. So, they were in high value at that time, but then that value actually decreased in time. And these people were not really able to expand and into new trades, etc. In sharp contrast with the Jews and the Syrian Christians, etc., who of course were successful in trade and also invested in land and so on. The other difference was the Syrian Christians were Syrian Christians. And these were Latin. They came under the Latin church, which converted a lot of lower caste people. So the Parangi were automatically